Warning! Parental guidance. Adult situations. Not to be listened to by children under 18 years old.
Chapter 1. The Irish Side of the Family Tree. Murphy Patrick Tolan, 1779 to 1832. In the beginning, there was nothing. Then on God's first day of creation, God made Ireland. Why Ireland, you may ask? Well, included in his Irish design, he designed Murphy's Law. And since Murphy's Law pertains to all of us, then he must have made it first. And that means we all have a little bit of Irish in us. Think about it. My great plus some more greats grandfather was lower middle class. The lower middle class did not have houses or mortgages. Most did not even live with a roof over their heads. I don't even think they had that many roofs in those days, and the ones they did have often leaked badly. At 16 years old, Murphy was single, had no children, or at least none he knew of, and lived a traveling gypsy style of life. Allow me to set the stage. In those days, people either robbed or got robbed, raped or got raped. They got drunk on beer in local taverns, rarely, if ever, bathed, and yet called themselves civilized, just as we do today. Toilets were unheard of, as was running water. My ancestor's name was Murphy Patrick Tolan. He was born on December 28, 1779, in a small house somewhere in County Cork, Ireland. Murphy did not remember much about the first dozen or so years of his life, but at the tender age of 16, he saw himself as a rather decent fellow. Rather decent fellows did not believe in robbing old ladies, young children, cows, or politicians. He never raped any woman, or men, at least whilst of sober manners, and he doffed his hat to anyone who looked like he had more money than he did. He was a pretty nice guy for this modern and civilized era. Murphy didn't own much of anything. The only things he actually had were the clothes on his back, one hat, a pair of old and holy shoes, a small knapsack with nothing of any real value in it, and a rusty hair comb he used to check for fleas and lice. He got through each day by doing odd jobs here and there. As the potato bug invaded Ireland and destroyed the potato crops, life got tough. Most of the middle and lower class became hungry, and as civilized people do, they first robbed their friends and neighbors until those resources were also exhausted. Now the population of Ireland had to make a decision about where to export themselves. The richer ones managed to move themselves and their potato hoards to secret locations before their friends and relatives attacked them. Many stood in queues for the great ships bound for Boston. There weren't many ships destined for the Americas, and thus the cost was close to a king's ransom to get a berth aboard one of them. Murphy had no idea that the more knowledgeable wealthy were on the move, but he did see a sign in Dublin that made him think. Will the last person to leave Dublin please turn out the lights? After enjoying the last couple of pints in the next pub he came to, my young ancestor decided to leave and walk to the harbour so that he would not be held responsible to turn out those lights. The harbour was a bustling mass of humanity. People, suitcases, and boxes of all shapes and sizes were moving in all directions, all over the harbour, except for in one area. On the third quay, he saw a man sitting behind a desk placed on the wharf and next to a smallish sailing ship. Murphy moved closer and overheard from afar that this tall and grey-bearded man, who was wearing a smart and fancy uniform, spoke with a very strange accent. The recent couple of pints had given him the courage he needed to walk up to the desk and doff his hat. The sea captain seemed friendly and explained to him that as the owner of this fine vessel, for 5 shillings he was offering people passage across the Irish Sea to a great new land on the other side. There was only one problem, though. The captain explained to single Murphy Patrick Tolan. Only married men could have passage across. Why only married people, you may ask? Well, the captain, born in Scotland, had crossed the Irish Sea with passengers often during the previous years and had realized that the income from transporting a married couple or a family on his smaller than average vessel was far greater than that of a single person. The overnight cabins aboard his ship were few in number, and he had learned that he could double his income by getting 2 people to share the tiny single bed in each 6 by 6 foot cabin. The hardest part in solving his problem was that all of the people who approached him and needed passage were single males. The canny sea captain, having found himself a dozen or so of the ugliest, most diseased and pockmarked tavern girls he had ever laid his eyes on, explained to Murphy that he had to be married to embark for the trip across.
"Well,"
replied Murphy,
"what do you suggest, sir? You can see perfectly that I am not a married man."
"Don't you worry yourself rotten, young man, for I have a wee young lassie up there,"
he said, pointing to a dozen or so of the ugliest old hags staring down at Murphy from the ship's railing above.
"You can marry. She needs to get across but has no money,"
replied the sea captain.
"But they are the most unfortunate women that I have ever had the chance to lay my young Irish eyes on, sir,"
a white-faced Murphy told the sea captain.
"So, do you want to get over there or no?"
was the reply from the much taller seafaring man, who had changed his tune pretty quickly.
"How much is it going to cost me to get a passage aboard your ship?"
Murphy asked.
"It's good you ask, young man, as I have a solution for your problem,"
returned the sea captain with a generous smile.
"As you will ken, we sea captains are allowed to marry young men like you on the high seas. Since you cannot get passage aboard my sailing vessel unless you are married, or about to be married, I suggest that you do a wee favour and give you a wife to complete the regulations of boarding my vessel. My offer to you, young man, is 12 shillings, 5 shillings for your passage, another 5 shillings for your new bride's passage, and 2 shillings for the marriage licence."
"But that's a fortune!"
Murphy replied, reeling backwards and nearly toppling into the harbour.
"Well now, look at it from my point of view. Not only do I find you a wife, but you also get passage across the Irish Sea to a new world,"
continued the sea captain with a grin.
"Now you seem like a rare, nice and intelligent laddie. I'll do you a very special favour. If you don't think this wee lassie is the one you want to live with for the rest of your life, then once we reach Scotland, I'll throw in a complete and final divorce, papers and all, with no strings attached. I certainly don't want you to be unhappy in the new world. This small and special favour to you, sir, will be another 12 shillings, making our dealings £1 of Irish currency and all."
Murphy could do nothing more than gape at the man.
"Well, young man, I've said my piece, and now it's entirely up to you."
"But I don't have that kind of money,"
stated my great, etc. grandfather, putting his hand in his pocket and mentally counting his total wealth of 3 single pennies.
"My ship here, laddie, the honest sailor, will sail with the tide an hour before dusk tonight, and you'll either be happily married on it or you won't,"
replied the sea captain, now stony-faced. Poor Murphy, having to marry one of those well-used old ladies, still waving and smiling at him as he stood below. He searched for any ray of hope that there could be a decent one among them, but counted less than a dozen teeth in total between them, and the youngest looked older than his great-grandmother, whom he had never known. What was he to do?
"Imagine what my future generations would say if they ever found out me marrying one of those old hags,"
he thought to himself as he unhappily left the harbour. Murphy was in a pickle, as Dublin had just about run out of all edible potatoes, and things were going to get very dangerous pretty soon. Within a couple of hours of leaving the sea captain, Murphy had picked out a wealthy-looking gentleman to receive the sizable piece of driftwood, which Murphy had found earlier on the beach, on his cranium. Not so hard as to kill him, mind you, but enough to put him to sleep for a long time, and to be able to relieve him of his financial worth. As stated earlier, the person selected to be the victim of this unjustly deed was not too old, too young, too poor, or a current politician of favourable standing. After filtering through the unconscious man's clothing in the shadow underneath a balcony, he found 7 shilling pieces and 9 pence, a crumpled letter from a sweet-smelling person called Fanny Slocum, a button, and a half-eaten piece of a very small, ugly-looking potato in his right trouser pocket. Hungrily consuming the meagre remains of the evil-smelling potato, Murphy pondered his next move. He wrote a short letter of apology to the poor unsuspecting victim, giving no forwarding address, and then wandered off to find the rest of the money he needed. In those days, people frequently had the overpowering need to consume a couple of pints of the local brew at weird times of the day. Nobody knows why this strange feeling came over Murphy, but it did, and again he walked into the nearest pub to satisfy himself. A few hours and several pints later, and after returning from the only ladies and gents communal toilet, namely the outside rear wall of the building, his stumbling gaze noticed a very dirty, unshaven, and rather evil-smelling gentleman sitting at his same table. The man had fallen asleep, and his face was dead center in a half-emptied plate of horrible-looking food. Murphy quietly sat down, and upon reaching over to dig into the man's remaining food, he glanced down to make sure that it wasn't a setup and that the man's hand didn't hold a knife or piece of driftwood in it. He did notice a very decent pair of leather boots on the gentleman's feet, though. He grabbed the snoring man's pewter tankard, gulped down the remains while looking around to see if anyone was watching him, and with reasonable force whacked the man further asleep with a dull thwack to the head. Swiftly, he ducked under the wooden table, sat on the floor, out of view of anyone else, and transferred the new boots to his own feet. Being a decent fellow, Murphy placed his own holy shoes next to the man's feet. Remember, electricity was not yet invented, and most of these establishments were dark inside and not well lit. During the boot removal process, he slipped his right foot into the second boot he had inconspicuously removed and felt a small bulge in the left corner. On inspection with prying fingers, he dug out 2 Irish £1 notes, carefully folded in the part of the shoe where the man's big toe had been. These notes had clearly not seen fresh air for several months and stank worse than the man himself, but Murphy felt like he had just won the Irish lottery. Sitting back in his original seat, acting innocently and not looking at his neighbor, still snoring into his now emptied plate of food, he motioned over the pock-marked wench of a serving girl and paid for his and his sleeping friend's bill with a shilling found in the jacket pocket of his first victim. He tipped her enough to get a kiss blown, and trying to look as invisible as possible, he left for the harbour, the honest sailor, marriage, and a new life. The Scottish sea captain, still sitting behind his desk, looked up and acknowledged Murphy's return. An hour or so later, just before dark, and with a dozen other good-looking and young middle-class Irishmen, Murphy was married in a communal ceremony to the lady the sea captain had graciously supplied. My ancestor handed over his £1 note and was given for the overnight cruise, one of the very small cabins, while his newly wedded bride held tightly onto his arm. Murphy couldn't look at the lady for more than a second or two before his eyes watered, and he had to turn away. He didn't know what was worse, her looks or the vile smell coming from deep inside her clothes. She must have been well over 80 if she was a day, and he had been lucky, because he had gotten the best-looking one of the bunch. Poor Murphy endured many hours of fending off the ugly lady's hot and excited advances. He was very eager to enjoy her short time with this good-looking young man, as well as to search every nook and cranny of his person for any money he might have hidden away. As the sun rose many grueling hours later, a couple of miles out from the Scottish port, Murphy and the other men were rudely awoken by the loud knocking on their doors and lots of shouting to get up on deck. The old hag was snoring loudly on the bed as he picked himself up off the floor. She had finally given up an hour or two earlier, after realizing that she was not getting anywhere with this man. He quietly rearranged his clothing, sneaked out of the smelly room, and was the first in line to dissolve his marriage certificate, as did the other men only seconds behind him. A one-sentence paper note of divorce was issued to all the exhausted men by the freshly groomed and ever-smiling captain. After finally berthing the vessel at the port of disembarkation, hearty goodbyes were issued by the crew, who made sure that none of the captain's ladies made a disappearing act and hurried the male passengers down the gangplank. As soon as the last snoring man was literally thrown off the vessel into the murky waters of the harbour, the ship's lines were tossed and she left for her return trip to Ireland. The captain was getting thirsty, and the taverns were much less expensive over there.
It won't take me long to get all these girls remarried again.
He laughed aloud and waved goodbye to his departing audience below. Welcome to bonny Scotland.
What's this? Did I see a short skirt on that man over there? Are my eyes playing tricks on me? What's that wailing music? Sounds like somebody is killing something slowly.
These were Murphy's immediate thoughts as he walked up to what seemed to him to be the main street of the small harbour town. Having no passports or custom officers to check up on duty-free liquor or the importation of taxable merchandise, my ancestor was a free man in a new land. Upon checking his stash, Murphy Patrick Tolan still had £1, 6 shillings and sixpence of Irish currency in his pocket. Being a man of substance and having money in his pocket, the odd feeling of necessary beer consumption returned, and he decided to enter the first pub he came to.
Do you serve beer?
Was his first question to the publican, who had just opened the bar for his morning trade.
Aye, laddie, we do.
Was the reply, and Murphy realized that the man had the same guttural accent the sea captain had had.
Fresh over from the old country.
He asked. Murphy nodded.
Arrived by sailing ship just an hour ago.
My ancestor stated.
You must have sailed over with my older brother, Wallace McTavish.
The bartender grinned, handing Murphy a rather smallish tankard of a brown brew that had smelly bubbles rising from the bottom.
That is good Scottish beer, and I'll have none of your lousy Irish remarks on it,
ordered the man, looking at his customer in a rather mean way, and then at the foreign coin Murphy was handing over.
He certainly does look like the brother of the sea captain.
Murphy thought to himself.
Most establishments don't accept Irish money, and this here public house is one of the few places where you can get Scottish currency in exchange for Irish. I'll do you the favour if you do as I ask.
The publican continued.
Here we go again. Hope he hasn't got the same old hags in the back of his bar as his brother had on the ship.
Murphy thought to himself, and a shiver of dread moved up his spine.
Once you finish up your pint, we have a bathhouse out back. You will use it.
Murphy nodded.
Then I'll serve you a hearty plate of eatable food for lunch, and a large slice of first-class Scottish Angus beef for your dinner, in your own private room upstairs. Here the famous Maggie Murdoch of Kilmarnock will give you a night's pleasure, all for just 10 shillings Irish. Now, laddie, how much do you have on you?
The publican ventured to ask. Murphy obediently told him and handed over all the Irish currency he had, since it didn't sound as though it would be much use to him in the New World anyway, and he hadn't seen any Irishmen returning on the captain's sailing ship. The brother of Wallace McTavish professionally flicked through the coins.
I take 10% for the currency transaction. That's 3 shillings. 10 shillings for your room and board in my fine establishment here, including the services of the famous Maggie Murdoch from Kilmarnock. But she will require an extra shilling from you after her hard work as her tip. You can drink as much beer as you want to today, and I'll give you a wee bottle of scotch to take with you on your departure tomorrow morning,
stated the publican, doing the math in his head while looking directly into my ancestor's widening blue eyes. Poor Murphy, suddenly understanding what this was all about, watched his second and last Irish pound rapidly disappear into a drawer under the counter, as well as the remaining coins of his Irish currency.
Here's your change, 18 shillings and 1 sixpence of good Scottish currency. Now drink up and run along to the bathhouse, as I see another young man needing my exchange rates.
Murphy looked around and noticed one of the other men, who had sailed with him the previous night, walk into the darkened interior of the pub. He knew that it was a rip-off, even for those days, but understood that easy come normally ends with easy go in the world of dishonest men. Murphy had a feasting day of good plain food and lousy beer. My ancestor tried to console himself that the high price did include a lot of beer, food, and pleasure. The food, meat, and Maggie were tasty, tender, and enthusiastic in that order. He had his night of rough and tumble sweat with the young and famous Maggie McMurdoch from Kilmarnock, whose real name was Maggie O'Neill, a young colleen from Ireland. He left the bar early the next morning, with his promised bottle of liquor from the publican. Upon leaving, Murphy noticed 3 of his shipmates from the previous day, also heading out from the upstairs rooms, and in different directions. Not having a decent breakfast that morning, he was now hungry, and after a short search found a type of breakfast diner around in those days. With gusto, he lashed down a massive helping of Scottish sausage and eggs. Curious, he asked the serving wench what the main ingredient of the sausage was.
Blood,
she replied, as if he was stupid, and he quickly rushed out of the diner and deposited his 2 pence worth of breakfast on the nearest street corner. The same happened with lunch after trying the dish of the day at the local upmarket hotel further down the street. This time the main ingredient was
animal guts.
And Murphy realized that the streets of his new world were not paved with gold, but partly digested remnants of his fellow Irishmen's breakfast and lunches. After lunch, he even tried the local brew at another pub to help get the taste of guts out of his mouth, and again he found it not black and smooth as he was used to an island, but the same bitter beer, almost transparent and filled with the smelly bubbles floating up from the bottom of the jug. Poor Murphy. He realized life was not going to be the same carefree sex, drugs and rock and roll that his old country of Ireland used to offer. Here, everyone talked about money, wore skirts, played screeching, ear-splitting music, and drank horrible beer. My ancestor left the small seaport in disgust and walked east. There wasn't much to see apart from large open fields. There was also a high road and a low road winding through the endless valleys and hills. He decided to take the low road, as it seemed the warmer thing to do, and at night slept under bushes and trees. On his third day, he approached his first village and found it reasonably clean and filled with much happier people. People who seemed friendlier than those he had met on the coast. This village was filled with an atmosphere of contentment. After a few months of searching for employment, he was down to his last few pennies when he finally pleaded hard enough to land a job in the town's only bar and brewery. His first job would be sweeping out the floors of the 2-storied bar and washing down the back wall of the building and the insides of the ladies' only private outhouses. At least he got room and board with his lowly position. He worked hard, and in the second year he was promoted to a higher position. Here he learned how to brew the smelly, brown-coloured beer. This local brew was a little smoother than that made on the coast, but still semi-see-through and filled with horrible little bubbles that gave him really bad gas. A big problem when trying to impress pretty members of the opposite sex. After a few months, Murphy got used to the food, but could never forget about the lovely black brews of the old country. In his third year, he was promoted to manager. Ever heard of the luck of the Irish? Well, one day, a couple of years later, the portly owner of the tavern was run down by a horse while he was attempting to run across the muddy road to the local money depository.
It must have been the weight of the money in the bag he was carrying, or maybe a glass or two of his brew that slowed him down.
Murphy thought as he heard of the event from behind the bar. He ran to the rescue, but was too late, except to hear the owner mutter his last words. Those words described a vigorous sexual encounter with bloody, stupid horses, and the use of other disgusting verbs that would lead female horses to become pregnant and male horses happy. Anyway, the old brewmaster had no children, and his wife had passed on just a year earlier after suffering from a transmitted disease that, as the doctor had explained, completely ate her brain away. She had been only 38 years old, the poor woman. The deceased publican had now been trodden on at 40, and wee Murphy was still in his prime at 21. There was no one else around to continue the line of inheritance. Who was now to manage the ladies upstairs, make the beer, deposit the money over the road? So naturally Murphy took over and did what he had to do, and thanked the Lord, asking him to give special care and favour to the dead publican, his deceased family, and those horses in his Irish prayers each and every night. Murphy ran his newly inherited business well for the next several years. The old publican would have been proud of him. He threw out all the hags upstairs and replaced them with young, good-quality girls, whom he tested personally during the interviews. This shrewd business move on his part gave the pub an air of upgraded quality about it. Then he set about trying to copy the smooth black beer of his old country Ireland. He didn't do too badly, because anything was better than the current brew, and his was smoother and better tasting, and the much darker beer became the rage of the town. To make his pub different from any of the others, and to win clientele for the new ladies, the upstairs rooms were refurbished to look like the cabins of a sailing ship. This gave the locals a feeling of being on the high seas while in the heights of pleasure, and made their experience a little more exciting and different. He had learnt well from the McTavish brothers, as his patrons were more than happy to pay a little extra for these modern upgrades. One afternoon, Murphy was test driving one of the new girls, fresh in from Ireland, a pretty young Colleen, so desperate and hungry that she would do anything for a job, when he was interrupted in mid-stroke by Moira, the cleaning lady. Moira was the daughter of the local coffin maker. 18 and a budding beauty, Moira was a simple girl, and certainly not the sharpest tool in the shed. But she was beautiful enough, so that most of the men in town wanted a chance to woo her. Being an undertaker's daughter Moira's only knowledge of a man came from her family job of washing the dead. Nakedness was no shock to her, but she had no reason to associate it with pleasure. She was just the very quiet and obedient daughter of a strict and silent father, her mother having died some years earlier.
Whoops! Whoops! I'm sorry, sir.
Moira said in surprise as she walked in to find her boss naked, on the large bed, and on top of a pretty girl she didn't recognize.
I had no idea this room was in use. You forgot to set the door latch and engage sign.
She stated, looking down at the two startled bodies on the bed.
So, what are you doing there?
She asked with friendly interest. She noticed sweat on the lady's brow and an expression of pleasure. Very calmly and without moving, Murphy replied,
I'm testing this young Irish lassie here for a position in the pub.
What position would that be, sir?
She asked in an innocent way. Moira was in her first week at the pub, cleaning during the day, and she had never realized what went on after hours.
A member of the upstairs lady staff, Moira.
Murphy replied with a grin, in a sort of tensely semi-frozen position, still deep inside the girl beneath him.
Could I have an interview like this?
She asked with innocent interest.
Maybe I could also be one of the upstairs staff.
Why?
Asked Murphy in surprise.
Well, I never seen anybody naked before. Who wasn't dead, and she looks like she's enjoying it immensely.
Moira replied, not taking her eyes off the sweaty girl once.
I'll make a deal with you, Moira.
Murphy said, smiling at her and thinking carefully.
Give me my piece with this lady, and I'll think about a special birthday gift for you.
Then he turned back to the pretty girl beneath him and began thrusting into her again. To her surprise, Moira pulled a chair up to the bed right next to them, sat down, and leaned forward to watch every move. Her mouth was open and her bright green eyes wide. Of course, Murphy was greatly inspired by this and proceeded with gusto until he had completed a performance that any man alive would have been proud of. With sweat dripping off him, he rose and walked naked over to the wash basin in front of the curtained window. The sight of her first live, naked man, still semi-erect and in excellent condition, now transfixed Moira. He looked nothing like the dead fellows she was accustomed to washing down. She turned and continued to watch him as he walked across the room to the wash basin, picked up a hand cloth, and began to wash himself. The Irish lassie, still naked, also got out of bed, followed him, and began washing his back. She desperately wanted the job. Moira couldn't resist joining in any longer, and in a flash, she also went over to the window, grabbed another cloth in her hand, and slowly started wiping them down in the area she couldn't take her eyes off. The Irish lassie didn't seem to mind the other girl, and while she washed his head and shoulders, Moira focused on the part that had caught her attention. She washed him with a tenderness that caused her some innocent amazement as he responded. Moira looked up into Murphy's eyes questioningly, and he had to stop himself from taking her right there and then. She looked down at the growth she was still softly wiping, as Murphy stood there motionless and closed his eyes. It had grown every time she had wiped it with a cloth, so she gently continued to see if it would grow some more. Even the Irish lassie was impressed at what Moira had managed to coax out of her new boss. The Irish lassie got the job. Murphy had to throw out one of the other girls, but he gave her Moira's cleaning position. Naturally, the girl accepted, became a very good cleaning lady, and was also useful in times of overflowing demand upstairs on Saturday nights. During her shift the next day, Moira was told of her dismissal as cleaning lady, but was told to come back for her belated birthday present on the morrow. The next morning, Moira returned and was given her birthday present as promised. At first it was very painful for Moira to help Murphy get himself into her. Slowly she stretched, struggled, twisted and turned. Once she was used to him, she softly started gyrating her lower anatomy. Gently following her like a dancer, as he had been forced to lie on his back, he let her have her way and patiently waited for her to get used to him. Pain slowly grew into pleasure until she moved faster and faster, and she felt the ecstasy that she had seen in the Irish girl's eyes build up in her own body. Time seemed to move slower and slower and finally stand still until they both screamed in unison and fell back together exhausted. They then curled themselves into a ball and slept for the rest of the morning. Once awake, Moira would not let him leave her. She led him to the wash basin, as she had before, and washed him down. It took time, but with soft movements she got him back to size, and then she guided Murphy back to the bed, where she gently dominated him for the second time that day. Innocent and direct, she asked for more of him than he had ever dreamed he could give. At last he lay back exhausted in an unfamiliar state of absolute euphoria and held her close. He watched her smiling eyes flutter and close and felt the gentle touch of her sleeping fingers on his shoulder. He married Moira a few weeks later. Murphy had little choice. She wouldn't leave his side in case he wanted to test drive some of the other girls for a change. The daughter of the local undertaker was in love with her man and had 3 children by him. The first was called William, born in 1801. My direct ancestor Maureen, their only daughter, was born in 1802, and finally Murphy Jr. was born in 1809. Moira's care for her husband and children led to the first of many family fortunes recorded through the manuscript. Any fortune before that was unlikely, since Murphy's forebearers drank it before they could accumulate it. Another phenomenon rare in today's society. It also took several generations before we lost this accumulating fortune to the bloody English, who invaded and then taught the sober and decent Scots new rules about raping and pillaging. Also, several generations later, Murphy's great Irish genes manufactured a William, this is in volume 2, who nearly met the King of England. Impressive. Murphy had a good and rich life. His pub and brewery, as well as the undertaker business he had inherited after Moira's parents passed on in later years, amassed a reasonable fortune for that era. He died one rainy morning, many years later in 1829 after, yes, you guessed it, being hit by a horse while trying to run across the muddy road to the local money depository. He must have been slowed down by the weight of the money in the bag he was carrying, or maybe by a glass or 3 of his very smooth black brew. Murphy's last 2 words concerned a vigorous sexual encounter that would lead female horses to become pregnant and male horses happy. Before his death, Murphy had finally learned to wear a skirt, listen to that screeching music, and digest the local food. And he had solved his problem of bad gas. Murphy Patrick Tolan was laid to rest in a grand oak coffin made for himself, by himself, years earlier as a joke. In his will he asked for a gallon jug of his latest brew to be placed in the coffin for the journey, into whatever lay in front of him. Oh, did you hear that? That must be my Uncle Buddy knocking on the door to walk with me down to the pub. I promise to get on to chapter 2 tomorrow. Be there. Bye for now.